In our department, we had strict policies on how we handled 911 calls that were either accidental dials or silent static. We always sent 2 officers to the address to check why and how the call was made. Our state had a database with this information and published statistics on these incidents every year. Additionally, it served as a deterrent against prank calls from kids and elderly people who called dispatch just to have someone to talk to. As I mentioned before, we were in a fairly small county. This particular case involves some very strange 911 calls from a newly developed neighborhood in our jurisdiction. Shortly after I started working as a deputy in early 2001, real estate developers began building expensive homes in a new subdivision along one of the county's largest creeks. Seemingly overnight, a massive wooded area transformed into homes valued at over $800,000. At night, another deputy and I would conduct foot patrols through the new development. It was a way to pass the time on quiet nights and also satisfy our curiosity about just how big those houses were. However, there was one large Victorian-style, 2-story house overlooking the river that we usually walked past quickly. I could never quite explain it, but I always had an uneasy feeling whenever we walked around the property and inside the house while it was still under construction. The other deputy, a good friend of mine, would always say that the shadows are watching you whenever we walked through that house. We jokingly called it Marilyn Manson's lair. We never felt weird anywhere else in the subdivision. Months passed, and by early summer, most of the neighborhood was complete. People started moving in, and all sheriff's department shifts began patrolling the area. However, the house that gave me that strange feeling had apparently stopped construction. After speaking with the general contractor, I learned that 3 potential buyers had been interested in the house, but all backed out for various reasons. That wasn't unusual given the high prices and uncertainty over property taxes, but something about it just didn't sit right with me. After talking to some of the subcontractors involved, it seemed like the potential buyers had toured the property and backed out of the deal as quickly as possible. By December 2001, a buyer had finally been found for the house, but the closing was delayed to resolve some utility issues in the area. About 2 weeks before the new owners were set to finalize the purchase, our dispatch center received a 911 call from the house with complete silence. I was on duty that night and took the lead while another deputy responded as backup. I switched to our secondary radio channel and started asking dispatch a lot of questions about the nature of the call. All the dispatcher could tell me was that she was getting silence. The callback number was displaying all 6s, and the address was showing as the creepy house in the new development. I found this very strange because just a few days earlier, the general contractor had sent our department the official house numbering for that street. I assumed our dispatch supervisor had updated our 911 system to reflect the new addresses. When I arrived at the house, it was completely dark. I stayed in my patrol car and lit up the house with my spotlight while waiting for backup to arrive. Nothing unusual was found, and there were no signs of vandalism. However, the entire time I was there, I felt an overwhelming heaviness, as if something was pressing down on my shoulders. We marked the call as unfounded. After we left, I informed our patrol sergeant about what had happened. He assumed it was a glitch in the 911 system and said we needed to report it to the day shift's dispatch supervisor. The next morning, I reported the error to our dispatch supervisor and was met with a confused expression. She told me that this was impossible because the utility company had not yet installed phone service in any of the houses in that part of the development. Apparently, that was the exact utility issue preventing the closing for the new homeowners. She said she had been waiting until the end of the week to update the 911 system with the new addresses, because it would be a waste of time to load new addresses without phone service. So, the address should not have been able to appear in our computer-aided dispatch CAD system. I trusted our dispatch supervisor's assessment. She had worked in the county for over 10 years, had seen the 911 system designed and implemented, and generally did an excellent job. So I took her word for it, which made me even more uneasy. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I passed the issue on to the day shift sergeant and asked if one of the deputies could follow up with the phone company if they happened to be working near that house. Later that night, I found a note in my patrol box that read, "The phone company is working on lines across the street from Kunpo 345 Name Street. They won't be working at that address until the end of this week. The phone company has no idea what's causing the 911 issue. Maybe dispatch got the address wrong. That night, dispatch received another silent 911 call from the same house again, with the supposedly impossible address. Once again, we responded, and once again, nothing unusual was found. The deputy who responded with me that night later told me that he felt like he was being watched the entire time we checked the perimeter of the house. I could still feel the weight of something as I walked through the house. The next morning, the patrol sergeant and I spoke with the dispatch supervisor. We basically told her that the impossible was happening and that we needed to get to the bottom of it. She pulled the records from the previous night, and sure enough, the impossible address was being dispatched from unknown phone lines to our 911 system, which then fed into the dispatch operator's CAD and our onboard computers. That night, we all received an email from the dispatch supervisor saying she had no idea how this was happening, but believed it was a glitch that she had fixed in the 911 system. However, she added the new addresses anyway since the phone company was almost finished working in the area. Basically, she had no clue what was causing the issue. We started receiving 911 calls for the house every night. Our patrol sergeant finally told dispatch that we would not be responding until the buyers moved in. Strangely, that made me feel a lot better. I absolutely hated responding to that house. The following week, on one of my nights off, I heard over my radio that the differential shift patrol sergeant told 2 deputies to get to the bottom of whatever was going on at that house. Apparently, he believed kids were somehow tampering with the phone system and just trying to waste the county's time. Out of boredom and curiosity, I called the patrol sergeant on his cell and asked if the 911 call had come in as silence, as had happened to us multiple times. He said that this particular call was completely terrifying. Dispatch had answered the call and it sounded like someone was gagged or that the phone was completely muffled. Apparently, the person on the other end seemed to be in distress and was speaking at a rapid pace. At this point, the new owners had not yet moved into the house, and as far as I knew, they hadn't connected phone service. Just like all the other times before, the deputies arrived on the scene, checked the perimeter, and inspected the house as thoroughly as possible, but found nothing. However, one of them mentioned feeling an unusual cold as he walked near the back of the property. I later spoke with him, as that was quite strange. He was the only one who felt it, and our average nighttime temperature in December stays just above 55°F. The deputy who reported the cold was instructed by the sergeant to park in front of the house for a few hours to watch for anything suspicious. Apparently, the deputy stayed for about an hour and a half before vomiting 6 or 7 times on the side of the road and leaving for the night. I spoke to him about his experience a few days later. He said he felt fine after leaving the area, but the longer he stayed near the house, the sicker he felt. Anecdotal at best, but it still freaked me out. A few weeks passed, and the new owner's husband, wife, and 2 kids moved in. They lasted less than 3 months before putting the house up for sale at a significant loss. We received numerous 911 calls from the owners, ranging from reports of intruders in the area to break-ins with a suspect supposedly still inside the house. At this point, the calls were coming from the alarm company rather than the owners themselves. Apparently, they had installed a high-end security system with motion sensors that would alert the security company after the owners armed the system in the master bedroom before going to sleep. 8 out of 10 calls we received were for motion sensor activation alarms. I probably responded to that house about 20 times in 3 months. I think the alarm company was there about the same number of times, but could never find a fault in the system. The husband was constantly traveling for work, leaving the wife and kids home alone for most of the 3 months they lived there. The wife was absolutely convinced that the house was haunted. Now, based on my interactions with her, I tended to believe her. She was well educated, very articulate, and her description of moving shadows scared the hell out of me because it was eerily similar to what my deputy friend had encountered. In fact, my deputy friend, who used to respond to calls with me, made a point to tell the wife that he had seen something similar before the house was even finished being built. I still jokingly blame him for costing that family a lot of money after they fled from there. Before the family moved out, we encouraged them to contact their alarm company and install cameras that would activate with the alarm system to see if they could get to the bottom of what was causing the motion sensors to trigger and call the security company. However, they never did. I think the wife's insistence got to the husband, and he sold the house just to make her stop talking about it. During their last month there, our sheriff deemed it necessary to send an off-duty deputy to sit outside the residence on more than 3 occasions, just to reassure the wife. Each time, a different deputy was sent. All of them reported feeling uneasy during their shift, but none of them reported seeing anything suspicious. Since that first family left, that house has had at least 12 different owners since 2002. We continued receiving 911 calls either from the alarm company or silent calls while I worked at the department. Most homeowners didn't stay for more than a year and a half. I think most of them stuck around just long enough to sell the house at a reasonable price to the next poor, unsuspecting buyer. I particularly felt sorry for the family that got stuck with the house during the 2008-2009 housing crisis. I can't emphasize how strange this is, considering that most of the original homeowners in the neighborhood still live there, and we rarely received calls for any other house in the subdivision. I could probably write a book about that house based on the 9 years I worked in the department. I was dispatched one night to a disturbance involving a possible 103 in our department's code for a person suffering from mental illness. On such calls, we usually send 2 officers. However, for reasons I can no longer remember, I was the only officer available at the time. The area where the disturbance was reportedly taking place was a retirement community consisting of about 40 houses on small lots, arranged in an H configuration, with 2 short cul-de-sacs connected by a cross street. As expected, this was an area where we usually had serious problems. It was generally very quiet, and since it was almost midnight when I received the call, I assumed that if a disturbance was indeed happening, it would be easy to locate upon arrival. At the scene of an active disturbance, it's not uncommon to hear a cacophony of yelling, screaming, cursing, loud music, the sounds of things breaking, and fighters hitting, slamming, and crashing into each other, sometimes even gunshots. So, upon arriving at a reported disturbance, stopping to listen for sounds of violence before rushing into the fray is a conditioned response. I entered the retirement community and began looking for the address I had been dispatched to. I had been in the area almost daily for several years, so it felt strange that I had never noticed the complete lack of functional overhead lighting along the streets. Has it always been this dark here? I asked myself as I drove slowly, scanning the addresses on the mailboxes. For some reason, that thought sent a chill down my spine. When I reached the designated address, I notified dispatch that I was 1097 code for IM here before stepping out of my vehicle. Initially, I heard nothing as I stopped to listen, which briefly led me to the optimistic though unrealistic notion that perhaps the disturbance had ended and the participants had already fled the scene. However, before I could fully dismiss that frivolous thought, the silence of the night was pierced by a sorrowful moan that seemed to echo around me, gradually fading away as if someone had reluctantly turned down the volume. I couldn't tell where the sound had come from, and I felt foolish as I quickly turned my head from side to side, searching for the source. The moaning started again so softly at first that the noise of my own movements initially masked its return. From nearly imperceptible, it rose in volume rapidly, only to vanish just as quickly. Using my flashlight to cut through the darkness, I did my best to locate whoever was making the sound. Despite my best efforts, I found nothing, or rather no one. The eerie moaning continued for, I don't know how long I stood there listening to it start and stop over and over again without any discernible pattern. No matter what I tried, I couldn't determine where it was coming from. I was pulled back to reality when I heard my radio crackle as dispatch called to check my status. I responded that I was code 4 as close as I could be, given the circumstances, and as I started walking toward the residence's front door, I suddenly realized that the moaning had stopped. I cautiously continued toward the door, listening for the moaning or any other indication of an ongoing disturbance. The only light coming from the house was a faint bluish flicker visible through 2 long, narrow, opaque windows on either side of the front door. As I was thinking to myself how nice it would have been if the homeowner had thought to turn on the porch light, a voice behind me slowly and quietly said, "Sorry for disturbing you at this hour, officer." I turned, and my flashlight illuminated the bare chest of a very large, completely naked man walking toward me. I stood frozen on the house's walkway, stunned, as the naked man passed by me and walked toward the front door. "Come in," he said as he disappeared into the dimly lit entryway. I paused just long enough to notify dispatch that I had made contact with the homeowner, or at least I assumed he was the homeowner, and to request another unit to my location. Then, I followed naked guy inside. Given the well-known tendency of cops to mercilessly mock each other, I saw no reason to inform dispatch that the homeowner was approximately 64, 260 pounds, and completely naked or naked, as we say in the South. Since there seemed to be little concern that naked guy might be carrying a weapon, I focused on determining the cause of the reported disturbance. The front door led directly into a sparsely furnished living area. Against one wall was a small desk, stacked with piles of papers, barely visible under the dim glow of a floor lamp beside it, which must have had a 20-watt bulb at best. Along another wall stood the source of the flickering bluish-white light, an old television set complete with genuine rabbit ears antennas, sitting atop a rolling cart. Though the TV was on, there was no programming displayed, only the snow of a television receiving no signal. The only other light in the room came from my flashlight. Naked guy settled into an oversized, upholstered rocking chair in the middle of the room, directly in front of the television, and softly said, "A police officer is here, Mama," staring intently at the screen. "Mama." I quickly swept my flashlight across the room, so quickly, in fact, that I had one of those "what was that?" moments and had to reverse my direction to take another look. Moving the beam more slowly, I stopped on the face of an elderly woman. She sat quietly in the semi-darkness, nearly invisible without the aid of my light. The reflection in her glasses made me realize I was shining my flashlight directly into her eyes. "Sorry, Mom," I said, shifting the beam away from her face. Suddenly, the now familiar moaning filled the room louder than before, and I realized that the sorrowful tones it heard outside had been coming from naked guy. Whatever was causing the level of distress necessary to produce such a mournful wail had gripped him once more, inflicting anguish with renewed vigor and determination. As he sat in his chair, nearly howling as he rocked back and forth, I wondered if his pain was physical or psychological. I glanced back at the elderly woman for some guidance or suggestion, but she seemed completely unfazed by the noise. Realizing something had to be done, I directed my flashlight at the man and said loudly, "Sir," using my most authoritative police voice. "Sir, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" Despite my attempt to engage him, I was initially ignored. Moments later, however, the volume of the moaning began to fade until it soon stopped altogether. "What can I do to help you, sir?" I asked naked guy. "Did you call the police?" Naked guy shook his head no, and, without looking at me, whispered, "Mama called." Then suddenly, he turned to look at me. "Make them stop. Please make them stop," he pleaded. "Who?" I asked him. "Make who stop?" Naked guy stared at me silently, expressionless. "I'm here to help you, sir," I assured him. "Tell me what they're doing and I'll help you." Naked guy turned back to the television screen. "The people on TV," he said in his now familiar, slow, calm voice. "Make them stop." A chill ran down my spine. Where was that other unit? "The people on the television are talking to you?" I asked the disturbed man. "What are they saying?" Naked guy answered in that same slow, calm voice. "They tell me lies," he explained. "Please make them stop with their lies, please." Like a child, naked guy placed his hands over his ears and began rocking again, staring at the television screen as if hypnotized. I looked at the TV once more, still seeing only the flickering bluish white of a static-filled screen and hearing nothing. No sound. "What are they lying about?" I asked him. "They're saying Mama doesn't want me to live here anymore," he whispered. "That I have to leave." Naked guy explained, "I don't want to leave Mom. She takes care of me. When the people on TV start talking to me, she makes them stop." I was so focused on calming naked guy to prevent him from resuming that horrible wailing that I had mistakenly ignored the elderly woman. It occurred to me that I hadn't checked her for weapons. "How do you stop the people on TV from talking?" I asked the woman, turning to make sure she was still sitting behind me. She turns off the TV and faces it toward the wall. Naked guy explained, pulling my attention back to him. Sometimes that works. I considered Naked Guy's suggestion. Let's try it, I told him, walking over to the television, using my flashlight, and wondering how much longer until my backup arrived. I located the outlet where the TV was plugged in and yanked the plug. The snow disappeared from the screen, and the TV went blank. Then, I turned the old cabinet-style television toward the wall. There, I said. Is that better? Naked Guy nodded. Are the people on TV still talking to you? Naked Guy paused as if he were listening to the voices. Then, he started sobbing. Intense sobs that made it seem like he was struggling to breathe. Suddenly, he stopped, paused, and whispered, I can still hear them. They're still talking to me. What are they saying to you now? I asked, leaning in closer to hear him better. He was rocking in his chair again, and I feared the disturbing wailing would start up any second. They're saying that Mom is dead, he screamed in distress, rocking back and forth. She's dead. They killed her. I had been leaning toward him, but upon hearing this, I shot up straight, as if a giant rubber band pulling me downward had suddenly snapped, releasing me. I realized I had let the circumstances distract me from everything I had been trained to do. Now I found myself alone in a house with a clearly disturbed naked man, probably 4 inches taller and 60 pounds heavier than me. Also in the room was what appeared to be an elderly woman sitting in the dim light. The last time I had checked, she was sitting silently behind me. Now I realized I had no idea who she was, whether she was armed, or anything about her. I started to get a bad feeling. The only thing I knew for sure was that I might be in trouble. While Naked Guy sat there crying and rocking, I turned to the woman, drew my gun, and pointing it downward at my side, shined my flashlight on her while slowly stepping toward her. Mom, I called out, raise your hands where I can see them. She remained still, her hands resting in her lap. Can you hear me, Mom? I said, raise your hands where I can see them. As I took another step toward her, I noticed that she was still sitting motionless, her hands still resting in her lap. Suddenly, I realized the source of my bad feeling. The elderly woman was dead. Then out of nowhere, I saw the welcome reflection of blue lights in the windows. My backup had arrived. Using my radio, I notified my team that I was inside the residence with 2 individuals, one of whom was possibly on 107 police code for deceased. The responding officer said another unit was on the way and asked if I wanted him to contact the coroner. Before I could respond, the elderly woman, sitting lifeless in the chair, leaned forward and said, I'm not dead, officer. I just wanted my son to think I was. I turned to look at Naked Guy to see his reaction. He was gone. What the hell? I thought, just as I heard my backup calling over the radio. One of your suspects is a huge naked guy? 104, I responded, somewhat reluctantly. Looks like he tripped while trying to run out the door, backup replied. I got him cuffed. Took 2 sets. I looked back at the elderly woman. Did you call to report a disturbance, Mom? Yes, sir. I did, she told me. She then explained that her son was bipolar and had stopped taking his medication. When he was off his meds, he believed he was possessed and that the people on TV were talking to him, telling him to do bad things. Earlier that night, she said, her son told her the people on TV had ordered him to kill her. As the night progressed, things got worse, and she realized she was in danger. Given her son's size and past episodes of violence, she felt the only thing that could save her was if he thought she was already dead. So, she called the police, reported a disturbance, and then convinced him she had passed away. She sat as still as possible, hands folded in her lap, holding her breath when he got close, only getting up briefly when he ran outside naked and started wailing. She said she only relaxed when her son slipped out of the house just as the backup officers arrived. Her son was transported by ambulance to a local hospital, where he was treated for his mental illness and later received the help he desperately needed. I never saw him again after that night. As for his mother, her son was her only family. So, I made it a point to check in on her from time to time, making sure she had everything she needed. Though she never said it, I always felt like she somehow blamed herself for her son's condition. About 8 years after that night, she passed away. Before she died, I promised her that I would make sure her son was buried beside her one day. It's a promise I intend to keep. Mental illness is often misunderstood, misinterpreted, and ignored. Law enforcement officers and agencies are frequently undertrained and unprepared to handle mental health-related incidents. Efforts to improve education and training for handling mental health incidents are ongoing and expanding. However, much more needs to be done. I encourage anyone with a family member or friend suffering from mental illness to join the effort to improve law enforcement education and training to better recognize and effectively respond to mental illness. Though it has taken a long time, it's not too late. I, along with several other people I worked with, had unexplainable experiences. One in particular has stayed in my mind. One afternoon, an elderly couple in a nicer neighborhood died in a murder-suicide. The husband had terminal cancer, and the wife was suffering from severe dementia. He laid her down on a plastic sheet in the living room, shot her, and then turned the gun on himself. He left a note, but it was somewhat incoherent and difficult to understand. Several months and a thorough cleanup later, a younger couple bought the house for an incredibly low price. It had been on the market for about 9 months, so they made a low offer and ended up purchasing it. About 3 weeks later, the wife called in the middle of the night saying that someone was inside the house upstairs. We all showed up, cleared the house, and found nothing. Both parents and both children told the same story. They saw a dark figure walk out of the hallway and into a bedroom. The same thing happened every night for the rest of the week. It got to the point where the entire family refused to go upstairs, and they kept the lights on 24/7. Eventually, they got tired of living in fear, so they went to stay with relatives for a while. They asked us to keep an eye on their house, which, to be honest, we had already been doing because who wouldn't want to see a ghost, right? They gave us access to their home and permission to enter if necessary. Late one night, I was driving by and stopped to check things out when I saw someone pass by an upstairs window, and then the light in that room turned off. I called my partner, and we entered the house. The atmosphere inside was awful. You just knew something was off. The air felt heavy and depressing, almost like the feeling you get in a funeral home but times 10. We searched the downstairs area and made sure there was no way anyone could have entered or exited. We weren't exactly thrilled about going upstairs, but it was our job, so we did. Let me tell you, upstairs felt disgusting and oppressive. Imagine being in a swimming pool and trying to run or move quickly through the water, but it's so restrictive that you can't. That's the best way I can describe the sensation. Suddenly, the same bedroom light I had seen turn off earlier switched back on. Creepy. We entered the room and nothing. Not a single person in the entire house. This was years before body cameras were a thing. So many of us got into the habit of carrying pocket digital recorders to protect ourselves and provide evidence if needed. When we reviewed our recording, we could hear a conversation, but it wasn't my partner or me. Our voices were easily recognizable, and the other voice was definitely not ours. It wasn't loud enough to make out what was being said, but it was clearly there. It was like someone was in another room talking, and you could pick up the conversation, but you couldn't quite make out the words. Neither of us heard the conversation while we were there in person. It made the hair on the back of our necks stand up and gave us chills listening to it. To this day, this memory remains vivid in my mind even though it happened early in my career.